We are going to take a break now from looking at what was going on around the Mediterranean, not talk about any of the European explorers at the moment, but instead shift our focus to other parts of the world, especially in the Pacific Ocean region, areas around Asia, as well as down in the South Pacific. So these are regions too where we see different civilizations going out and exploring the ocean. And in the case here in sort of North America, we tend to focus more on the European explorers than on explorers from other parts of the world. The civilization that we're going to focus on first are the Polynesians. And the Polynesians were responsible for most of the colonization of islands in the South Pacific, as well as places as far as the Galapagos and Hawaii. Depicted in this slide is the Polynesian Triangle. So what is going on here? Well, we sort of see a central area centered around French Polynesian, Tahiti, Bora Bora, the Society Islands. And this is an area where people first colonized roughly about 500 to 1000 AD. After that time, due to a number of reasons, a lot of them due to overpopulation, depletion of resources, food on the islands, as well as religious warfare, there's a drive for people within the civilization, or certain segments of the civilization, to spread out and explore, find new islands. So we see this outward expansion to the Easter Island, to New Zealand, and finally northwards to the Hawaiian Islands. So this outward spreading and colonization is responsible for the population of many of the islands within the Pacific Ocean. The journeys carried out by the Polynesians are quite remarkable. So consider this, you're a tribe, you lost in a religious war, you're basically forced to leave the island. How do you do this? What technology, what navigational techniques are there that allow you to travel over great expanses of the ocean? Well, there are many, and some of them are outlined in this slide. We see that Polynesians use double-hulled ships or double-hulled canoes. This greatly enhance their ability to travel great distances in a very stable vessel. Another thing they had were excellent navigation techniques, ways of finding their way on open water. You can imagine traveling over water, there's no land in sight. How do you know where to go? They used techniques such as studying the stars, wind directions. They even would taste the water and realize that when they came close to some islands, the water would taste less salty or more salty. Another thing they used was something that's called a stick chart, which is represented here in the upper right of the slide. This isn't a map per se, but it was a chart that showed or represented different paths, different ways to get to different islands. Usually the islands were represented by shells, and the sticks that we see here, the bamboo sticks, are representative of the routes that you could take to travel from island to island. Finally, they had excellent ways to preserve food, store food on board their ships, as well as the ability to transport live fire. The next group we're going to look at are the Chinese. And the Chinese also played a significant role in the exploration of the world's oceans, as well as development of some technologies that we still use today and that were vital in allowing people to explore the ocean in future years. One of the most notable of the Chinese explorers is Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He, in the early 1400s, led the largest ships in the world on 7 voyages of exploration, touring the Indian Ocean, and one of the purposes of his trip was to demonstrate Chinese excellence at shipbuilding and navigation, as well as just showing the wealth that China had and sharing that wealth with other countries. The ships in the fleet that Zheng He commanded were some of the largest ships the world has ever known. For example, Zheng He's flagship was believed to have 9 masts and measured over 400 feet long, or that would be roughly 122 meters. Historians were skeptical for the longest time about the size of these ships, and it wasn't until 1962 when workers along the riverfront of the Yangtze River uncovered a timber that was up to 36 feet long. This is believed to be a steering post. And they also found a massive rudder associated with it. So from that, they were able to determine that the ship would have been at least 500 feet long, if not 600 feet long, dated these wooden materials that they found, and found that the age was right to be one of Zheng He's ships. These ships are known as treasure ships. The goal of it was to display wealth and power, show kindness, and bring home exotic luxuries from other parts of the world. In comparison, or if you look at this diagram here, this image of a treasure ship, you'll see it compared to Vasco da Gama's ship, a Portuguese explorer and his ship that he sailed the world on, and that's only about 18 feet long. So these ships are massive. They're able to store food aboard them, fresh water. They're also able to have chickens, goats, and actively farm. Not only did the Chinese build these tremendous ships that sailed the Indian Ocean, displaying huge amounts of wealth to the world, but they also came up with many technical innovations that we still use today. For example, they developed the compass, and the picture that we see here is of an early Chinese compass. They also came up with the concept of a central rudder that made it much easier to steer and maintain boats on course during long voyages. Watertight compartments, an excellent thing, especially if you get a hole in one area of the ship. It ensures that your entire ship won't sink. And the ability to sail on multiple masts. Remember, once again, the flagship had at least 9 masts. Additionally, as I said in the previous slide, the ships had the technology or the ability to stay at sea for prolonged periods. They were able to distill seawater, so you would have fresh drinking water. They grew fresh vegetables on board, as well as kept animals on board, collected eggs and milk. The other purpose of this trip was to go along and collect and catalog cultural artifacts and scientific specimens for other countries, and bring this wealth of knowledge back to China. Now that we've talked about the Polynesian and the Chinese and their contributions to oceanography, let's return back to Europe and take a look at what was going on in Europe. One of the first groups we're going to talk about are the Vikings. And as you see, it was probably the Vikings that were the first Europeans to visit North America. They had these ships, they were strong, they were stable, they were fast, and they were excellent for sea voyaging, especially in the stormy North Pacific. The Vikings traveled extensively between what is now modern-day Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, venturing as far as the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, and even the Faroe Islands. It's believed that they reached Iceland and Greenland as a result of storms blowing their ships off course. Archaeological evidence points to that they reached Iceland at about 850 CE, Common Era, or Greenland at about 996 CE, so roughly a little over 1,000 years ago. An archaeological site uncovered in the 1960s along the northern tip of Newfoundland indicated the presence of the Vikings in North America. This is a presence that predated the time at which Columbus came to North America. It is believed that a Viking named Leif Erikson showed up around 1000 Common Era and established the only Viking or Norse site that's present on mainland North America. Greenland counts as part of North America too, and we do definitely have evidence of a Viking presence there. This site is known as Lanceau Meadows, which is actually a French word referring to the site. The buildings there have been restored and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For reasons that we're not entirely completely sure of, the Vikings eventually left the site and returned back to their homeland, and it sat unoccupied for a number of years. We're now moving into a time period known as the European Age of Discovery or the Age of Exploration. And this is a time period that ranged from about the early 15th century well into the early 17th century, when boats or ships from many different countries of Europe traveled around the world searching for new trading routes and partners. They were looking for things such as gold, silver, spices, silk. Most of this exploration that was carried out wasn't just done for its own sake to say, hey, what's out there? Let's take a look and see what's out there. But it was done with the material goal in mind. Let's find gold. Let's find silver. Let's get a hold of some of those spices and silks from what was known as the Far East. Many different European countries participated in the Age of Discovery. We find that some of the main players, the countries that really went out and looked around, were countries such as Portugal and Spain, England, France, and Italy to some degree. And that makes sense because these countries all border coastlines. They border the ocean. We could spend a lot of time talking about all of the European voyages of discovery, but what we're going to focus on is the Portuguese and the English. So here's a picture of the Monument to the Discoveries in Lisbon, Portugal. And on this monument, we have 30 statues of historical figures in Portugal's Age of Discovery. These include notable people such as Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan, who, although he was Spanish, sailed for Portugal and was the first person to sail completely around the world. Vasco da Gama, in case anyone was wondering, was the first European to reach India by sea. One notable Portuguese is Prince Henry the Navigator. He is believed to be sort of the initiator, the administrative initiator behind the Age of Discovery. He felt that ocean exploration held the key to great wealth and successful trade. So he's very pro-exploration. Send these ships out, explore, bring back goods. And in fact, he opened most of the west coast of Africa to commerce. It is believed that he established a school at a location in southern Portugal called Sagres, which is a school for marine science and navigation, although this is of some dispute at the moment whether or not this actually happened. But the important thing about Henry the Navigator is he was responsible for that initial stage of exploration. Without him, the age of exploration might not have gone as it did. The other thing he did was he created a new ship for the Portuguese called the Caravel, Caravel, which was a much lighter, much quicker ship that allowed them to navigate both from a military sense as well as travel quickly through the world's oceans. Another notable Portuguese, and I might have misspoke earlier, was Ferdinand Magellan. He actually worked for Spain. It wasn't he was Spanish and worked for Portugal, but a Portuguese navigator working for Spain, and he was the first person to complete a circumnavigation of the Earth between the years of 1519 and 1522. Interestingly enough, he was killed in 1521, and he himself actually did not complete the voyage, but his ship and his crew members did return to their home port, completing that circumnavigation of the Earth. And this brings us to the British. During the early part of the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, it was Portugal and Spain that pioneered European exploration of the globe. And while they were doing this, they established large overseas empires with great wealth associated with that. England, as well as France, were very envious of this, admired the wealth that was accomplished or established, and they themselves began to establish their own colonies and their own trade works throughout the world. During the 17th and 18th century, the British explored the world, colonized, and it got to the point by early in the 1900s that at least 24% of the Earth's total land area fell underneath British rule, or part of what we know as the British Empire. There are many British explorers that we could talk about, but the one that we're going to focus on is Captain James Cook. So Cook joined the British Merchant Navy as he was a teenager, and then finally became a member of the Royal Navy in 1755. During this time, he surveyed and mapped much of the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, as well as mapped most of the coastline of Newfoundland. So he spent a lot of time here in Canada. While in the British Navy, he also carried out 3 major voyages. These voyages are shown on the map on the slide. His first voyage is outlined in red, was carried out from 1768 to 1771. Second voyage, green, 1772 to 1775. And his third and final voyage, he died on this voyage, was from 1776 to 1779. One of the driving factors behind Cook's exploration, besides the fact that he was exploring and colonizing for Britain, was that he wanted to travel farther than any man had been before me, but as far as I think it is possible for a man to go. One of the primary reasons behind Cook's first voyage was to record the transit of Venus across the sun, and this needed to be done in Tahiti. His other purpose was to assert British presence in the South Seas. During this voyage, he discovered New Zealand. You'll note that I have discovered in quotes there because we already had Aboriginal people living in New Zealand at this time, so he really didn't discover it in a sense. He also mapped the Great Barrier Reef, he circumnavigated the world, and he also established a start of scientific oceanography. It's important to note that this wasn't a purely scientific oceanographic expedition. It was an expedition, as I said, that there were political or militaristic reasons behind it, but the fact that they went to record the transit of Venus across the sun for astronomers indicates that this is a voyage that did have a scientific component to it. On his second voyage, Cook traveled to higher latitudes in the southern hemisphere. He was the first person to circumnavigate the world, to travel around the world at a high latitude, 71 degrees south. He didn't make it to Antarctica, but he definitely did see icebergs, and very cold water. During this time, too, he also visited Friendly Islands, present-day Tonga, as well as Easter Island and Norfolk Island. On his third and final voyage, Cook, aboard the HMS Resolution Discovery, explored the west coast of North America, mapped the west coast of North America, and once again discovered the Hawaiian Islands. And we have discovery in quotations because there were already people living on those islands. He actually went to the Hawaiian Islands twice on this voyage. Initially, the start of his voyage, and then he returned to the Hawaiian Islands, which was probably a bad idea for him because it was that time that he was killed due to what was believed to be a misunderstanding between him and the British crew on his ship and the native Hawaiians. He died, but his ship once again continued on and returned back to port in London. The map here shows the red, that was the route that they took prior to his death, and then the blue is the route that the ship took, or the two ships took, returning home after his death. We should take a couple minutes on this slide and the next slide just to take a look and just marvel at the ability of Cook and his crew to map the coastline. This is a chart that was produced of the northwest coast of America and the northeast coast of Asia in his third voyage. And you can just get a sense, the coastline there looks very much how we know the coastline is today. And as you'll see in the next slide, some of these maps or these charts were so accurate that even up to World War II, Allied forces were using them to locate their position in the Pacific Ocean. As we said in the previous slide, Cook was a very good navigator and created very excellent charts. This is a map of some of the areas that he did chart or he did map out. You can see that there are some major corrections, some major mistakes. These are the ones that are indicated by blue arrows. Usually just is the off shift, the position of a country by a little bit. But once again, look at that west coast of North America. Excellent mapping along that west coast. He also, on his voyages, once again, this shouldn't be forgotten, made abundant scientific discoveries. He took samples, or his crew collected samples of marine life, land plants, animals, made notes on the ocean floor, geological formations that they might have encountered on their voyages, as well as contributed to natural history, anthropology, and oceanography as sciences in a whole. So Cook had a very large impact on oceanography and the history of oceanography and the exploration of the ocean. It needs to be remembered that although there was a strong scientific component to Cook's voyages, these voyages weren't true scientific expeditions. That distinction falls to the HMS Challenger. This is the ship that discovered the Challenger Deep, which is the first true scientific expedition, and they were inspired by Darwin's work on the Beagle in 1872. This expedition was organized by Charles Wyville Thomson, an Englishman, as well as John Murray, who was Canadian-born. This expedition was the first to use the term oceanography. Here we have a picture of Thomson and Murray. Couldn't tell you who is who there, and some of their crew, and to the right, a depiction of their ship. The expedition set sail December 21st, 1872, and went and took a 4-year voyage around the world, returning back to England in May of 1876. One of the unique things about this voyage was that the course was determined by the ship's scientific staff. It wasn't a government, it wasn't a monarchy somewhere saying, could you go there and do this? It was the scientists aboard the ship that said, hey, let's go check this out, or let's go check this out over here. They traveled all around the world. Of note, they did visit Halifax, and I've included on Acorn a list of, or PDF of notes that were taken on their voyage to Halifax. The accomplishments of the Challenger expedition are numerous, but here are some of the accomplishments. One of the first things was they wanted to investigate if ocean life could exist below a depth of 549 meters. Up to this point, people such as Edward Forbes, pictured here, thought that life was impossible beneath a depth of 49 meters. This is due to the tremendous pressures that organisms could experience at depths below that, as well as the lack of light and the water temperature. The Challenger expedition were able to obtain samples of living creatures from depths as great as 8,185 meters, so they definitely proved that life was possible at deeper depths. While doing this, they discovered over 4,000, almost 5,000 new species of marine life. Some of their other accomplishments, they took salinity, temperature, and water density measurements, were able to determine the physical structure of the ocean. They collected new data on ocean currents, the distribution of sediments within the ocean. They, as we know, discovered the Challenger Deep. They mapped up the location of new coral reefs. Here are some depictions of the results that they published, everything that they determined or found out was published in this huge multi-volume set upon their return. Very beautifully illustrated color plates of organisms that they discovered, as well as descriptions of every single stop or station that they visited on their voyage, and quite descriptive discussions. How deep was the water, the temperature, the salinity, what the bottom was like. It provided a really great picture of the time of what the ocean looked like. So they did discover the Challenger Deep. Here is the description of the station from when they visited here. Got up at 4 o'clock. At 6 o'clock, they sounded a depth of 4,575 fathoms, which equals about 8,184 meters. That was a lot of rope that they had to throw overboard to be able to measure that depth. They also were able to collect a sample from the bottom of the Mariana Trench there, and on the left there you can see a sample that's now in the museum or Natural History Museum in London of a sample of the radiolarian ooze that was collected by the Challenger expedition. We'll talk more about what ooze is in subsequent lectures. As I said in a previous slide, the HMS Challenger visited the port of Halifax between May 9th and 19th of 1873. They presented to the Provincial Museum some of the specimens that they collected to date. Here's a picture of some sea stars that were collected slightly off the south of Halifax, Nova Scotia, on gravel and stone. They also, interestingly enough, brought a specimen that they're going to donate of an ice-transported boulder of Shelburne granite that they found in the ocean floor some 300 miles south of Nova Scotia, but for some reason this boulder ended up overboard and now lies at the bottom of the Halifax harbor. As I said earlier, a copy of notes that were made during their visit is available to you on Acorn. If you want, you can go through and take a look and just read about what was going on as they were in Halifax during this expedition.